and describe them as they can't do this, they can't do this, they can't do this, there's no one left to actually stand up to the bad people, because they're not going to change.
You see, what you're describing is one element of our loss of identity, because essentially what identity politics actually paradoxically leads to is a complete loss of genuine identity.
And when you lose your identity, it causes stress, which is what we've talked about.
Well,
it causes stress because you don't know who you are, you don't know how you should behave, and in some ways you're lost. And if you're lost, then you're not actually free.
It is immensely powerful. It is one of the most brutal things you can do to someone to remove their identity.
Yeah, and also particularly with men in this day and age, you're also looking at, actually, I think men are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than women are.
It depends on the age group.
It's actually it's between the 49 and 55 age group. Give and take a year.
But the trouble also is that with the increased stress on women means that the amount of self-harm and suicide of women is shooting up.
Well, because in some ways, I'm not saying that their natural role should be actually the natural role is to be a mother, and so many people are being forced. I'm not saying forced because, as I've said before, I think it's very hard to live, particularly in London, with 2 partners, unless you got one partner who's earning significantly a lot of money. It's very hard for a man and a woman not to be working to be able to maintain a household anymore.
Indeed, and it was only this week that research came out that I think only 42% of people in the UK are now married. Whereas
but divorce has also come easier. You can do it online and things like this.
But if you think about it, even when we were children, it was unusual to have another kid in the class who had either divorced parents or had unmarried parents. Actually, it was unusual, highly unusual. Now it's the other way around. Now a kid with happily married parents is a rarity.
Well,
Why is this?
Not only that, but you've also got even probably the last 15 years or so, and I'll probably have to check the stats on this. That men and women, even when they have children, aren't necessarily married.
That's right. Well, exactly.
Because originally marriage was for tax purposes, wasn't it?
It was very helpful, yes.
Yeah, so it was. I think marriage was about because it was beneficial to be married for tax purposes in that case. Whereas now, I think common law spouses are still regarded in that respect.
And of course, it was for tax purposes because the lady often didn't work as much, so therefore they wanted to give the family a bit of a financial boost. But now, of course, with this supposed equality where both parents are working, then the government doesn't see any reason for giving the tax break.
Okay, so there you go. So anyway, I want to come back to this thing about the stress and the heart and how emotions actually impacts that, because there's a rise in cortisol.
Well, that's the key thing to understand,
which is a negative stress hormone.
It's the negative stress hormone.
Yeah.
And the most important thing to understand is that stress is more important for our health than exercise and diet.
So how do you reduce stress then?
Well, that is a huge question. It's an enormous topic because we have to start looking at what's wrong with modern society. And I'll give you...
Yeah, but you've got to adapt to modern society as well. You can't change modern society to reduce your stress. Well, you've got to adapt to modern society by knowing how to handle it and adapting to it and anticipating what's going to happen to actually relieve your stress, do you not?
But knowing what's wrong with society, you can then make up for some of its deficiencies.
Okay, let me put it another way. You can't control... You got no control over how the environment is in terms of what's happening outside your control, in terms of whether it's Brexit or whatever. That's how you control. What can you control and what can you do about it? Other than go to a Buddhist temple and meditate for 2 weeks and not speak to anyone and go inside yourself, which potentially you can do, I suppose, or breathing. Which is a more holistic method, yoga and things like this. So what can you reduce? What can you do to reduce stress that you can control?
there are any number of there's an endless number of things you can do which are incredibly important, but it's all based on understanding what's wrong with society. So, for instance, that we right now are on the cusp of an incredible opportunity, and the UK doesn't realise what opportunity there is for improvement of our society, because with an impending looming Brexit, you see, people just don't get. People are arguing about the wrong things. There is, of course, going to be economic problems if there is a Brexit, because you're leaving a 40-year marriage. Of course there's going to be problems. So if you try and argue and say there's not going to be any problems, then of course the Remainers are going to win that argument immediately. And a lot of Brexiteers just aren't articulate enough and not even self-aware enough to know and explain their gut feeling about why they want to leave. And the point is that Brexit is an opportunity to re-establish national identity and to re-establish proper community spirit. But it's not going to happen, is it? All that's going to happen is the politicians are going to take a win about having saved Brexit or saved Remain, and everyone is in their vested interest of being in their little position in power, and it's not going to achieve anything good for the people. But it's still an opportunity which is going to be missed. And then if you then go on to what individuals can do, obviously the key thing is that we're all chasing materialism. We're chasing illusionary needs constantly, whatever that may be. And the more self-absorbed you are, the less you pay attention to those around you, let alone your ethics, your morals, your religion, your cultural upbringing. All of that gets atomized. And because you automatically reduce your stress levels, because you automatically aim to reduce your anxiety by instinct, that means without thinking, then you never feel in control. And if you don't feel in control, you get stressed. So the key thing to understand, and it takes a lifetime of practice because we're hardwired, because we're cavemen, you can't change your nature. We are hardwired to reflexly anxiety reduce. Now, in the past, reflex anxiety reduction was just associated with escaping wild animals and achieving basic needs of survival. But nowadays, there's no real needs. There's no animals coming to get us, usually. So all we have is illusionary needs, and because they are not real, then the system starts going into overdrive because it's looking for something that is a real need, and nothing is ever enough.
Yeah, but have we not transferred that, what you call illusionary need, into... we've transferred that into modern societies, for example. So if you talk about, Maslow talks about bottom level of the pyramid, which is survival. So in terms of survival would be a roof over your head, food on the table and things like this. We still have to, just because we don't have to hunt for it, we have to go and hunt for money to be able to pay for these things. Isn't that it hasn't really sort of changed? It's just that how we execute that now is actually just very different to what we were in caveman days. Because if you can't pay a mortgage, then you haven't got a roof over your head. Because
the thing is, in the past, once you had your cave, that was okay. But now, very few people in the UK are homeless because you will be looked after by the state, usually. But that's not enough. Once you have a house, you want a bigger house. Once you have a car, you want a faster car, usually. Then there's your shoes, there's your holidays, and then everything has to be the ideal. So industrialization, one of the disasters of industrialization is chasing the ideal, whatever it may be. That restaurant's no good. I could have gone to a better restaurant. And as the psychologist Barry Schwartz talked about in his TED Talk, the paradox of choice. Once you have too much choice, then then you always wonder whether you could have made a better one. And if you make a wrong one, then the responsibility is yours. Whereas if you don't have much choice, then it's not even your responsibility necessarily if you make the wrong choice.
Yeah, but choice.
And you're the least happy. You're the least happy with too much choice.
Admittedly, but if you actually only have one choice, or two bad choices, I mean, admittedly, I'm a big believer in choice. That's why I don't believe in socialism, because you don't have a choice. So that choice is taken away from you in many ways.
You'd be amazed, because remember we talked about Tim Gilbert, who gave a lecture on the synthesis of happiness, and even if the most gross, if people are subjected to the most gross injustices or the most awful illnesses and disabilities, if you compare them to people who win the lottery, their level of happiness ends up being the same. So once you are given a situation which you cannot change, then people usually end up making the best of it and being okay and being happy. Equally, if you ask a millionaire what will make them happy, they usually say, make another million, which by definition means these guys are never going to be happy.
No, I do know that research actually as well, because they did talk about if you became a quadriplegic and if you won the lottery, within a year's time you'd probably be in that same position of happiness. But actually, you brought up the lottery twice today, and there's an interesting thing, because I read an article probably a couple of years ago now, about that, and they talked about actually, should people do the lottery or not? Is it a waste of money, or should they do it? And in some ways, one of the things they discussed, which really actually intrigued me, was actually if you play the lottery, it'll actually raise part of your dopamine levels, because the thing is, you're buying something which resembles hope. Even though it doesn't happen, and you're probably, and I think you even got used to that, it's not going to win every time. It just buying the lottery ticket it causes enough of a
dopamine
spike for you to actually say
it was worth it,
which ultimately relieves stress. So you're actually paying £2.50, like it's almost like medication in some ways, if you want to call it, which does reduce stress in some ways, because it gives you hope, because if it does come in, then you've got an end goal.
True, but then the more intelligent you are, the less use that is, because you know it's rubbish. So you won't find. It'd be very interesting to do the research, but I'd be surprised to find people above a certain IQ doing any lottery at all. Oh
no, no. Actually, I think there's a certain amount that people will actually start playing. So I think I remember it was one of these very, very rich bankers who was seen, he's cost this country, he earns like 100 million a year or something, and he still went and played the lottery for 100 million, and they took a photograph of him. I think it was on Twitter or something, I can't remember. So I think there's a level where people will probably have a little bit of a fun thing, but
there's always the exception. I'd still be surprised.
I occasionally buy the lottery, but the thing is, I've never bought a scratch card in my life. Whereas some people are, buy them on, will spend a fortune on them.
Now, you see, you just raised a very interesting topic, which correlates with one of my clients I saw yesterday, and that's gambling. And of course, the lottery is a form of gambling, is it not?
Oh, so is bingo.
So is bingo. But he was telling me some very interesting statistics, because he's actually heavily involved in the media in attacking some of these larger gambling houses. Now, the research shows that the average disposable income of families varies between £150 to £450 a month. Think about that for a second. Now think about the fact that these huge betting companies, they make enormous amounts of money, and you can place bets every 8 seconds. Think about that for a second. You can place bets every 8 seconds, and they make something like 80% of their profits from 10% of their clients. And therefore, those 10%, logically, that they cannot afford what they're doing, and the gambling companies know logically because the research has been done.
Well, I think there was a law passed a few months ago
limiting the maximum amount. So you're right. So the maximum amount has been on these one-arm bandit machines has been dropped from, I think it was £200 to £100. I could be wrong, but it's been halved essentially.
Yeah. And then there was this article about this gambling company